My own mom said, "I wish you were never born." I stood tall and said, "Consider me as if I never existed. Live your lives as though there was never a daughter named Claire." The whole party froze. The words hung in the air, sharp and chilling. I could feel the silence settle over the room like a thick blanket, smothering everything. Even the music, which had once played softly in the background, seemed to vanish into the weight of what had just been said. I didn't look at anyone, not my mother, not my father, and certainly not the colleagues and friends who had been laughing and sharing stories just moments before. I stood there, the echoes of my mother's voice ringing in my ears, and for a split second, I thought I might collapse. But something else rose instead, something that had been buried for years, something I had silenced inside myself for so long. Anger, hurt, resignation. All of it combined into a storm inside me that I could no longer hold back. I had spent my life chasing after her approval. From the time I was a child, I had worked tirelessly to prove my worth, to make my mother see me as something more than just a backdrop to my sister's perfect, flawless life. Ashley, the golden child, my younger sister, had always been the one who was praised, adored, and admired. If Ashley sneezed, my mom would run to fetch tissues, like she had just witnessed a miracle. If she brought home a ribbon for participating in something, anything, my father would make an announcement at the dinner table, as if she had cured a disease. But when I achieved something real, earned achievements, it was always met with a nod, a half-hearted smile, and a quick return to the focus on Ashley. I had spent my entire childhood and adolescence learning how to shrink myself. My accomplishments were never enough, never worthy of recognition. But that night, at the dinner table, I realized something I had been too afraid to acknowledge. I had spent my whole life trying to earn love from people who never truly cared to give it to me. And in that moment, my mother's words hit me like a cold, hard slap. I looked around the room at the faces of my colleagues, my professors, and my friends. People who had actually seen me, who had witnessed my work, my dedication, my struggles. For a second, I imagined what they must be thinking. They must have seen my mother's coldness, the way she dismissed my achievements without even a glance. They must have known that all these years, I had been fighting an impossible battle, a battle that I didn't even want to fight anymore. But I didn't say anything. I didn't cry, didn't shout, didn't break down. Instead, I simply turned and walked away. My chair scraped against the floor, cutting through the stillness of the room like a knife. I could feel every eye on me, waiting for me to crumble, to do what I had always done, submit, retreat, become small again. But I didn't. Not this time. I pushed the door open, stepping into the cool Seattle evening. The city lights blurred in the rain, streaks of gold and blue dancing across the pavement. I could hear the distant hum of traffic, but it felt like it was miles away. The cold air caught my breath, sharp and unfamiliar. I stood there on the sidewalk for a moment, not knowing what to do next, not knowing if I even wanted to go back to the dinner that had just shattered everything I had held onto. It wasn't freedom that I felt, not yet. It was more like severance, like I had been untethered from something I had once believed I needed. My parents, their approval, their validation. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing after it anymore. And for the first time in my life, it felt like I was allowed to breathe again. Growing up, it was always Ashley, Ashley, Ashley. The golden child. The perfect daughter. My younger sister. From the moment she was born. She had captured my mother's heart in a way that I would never be able to. It wasn't just that my sister was good at everything. It was that everything she did was celebrated, as if she were a beacon of light shining on our family. I could never escape that light, because it always seemed to blind my mother to me. I remember the first time I realized it, I must have been about 5 years old, and we were sitting at the kitchen table, eating breakfast. I'd drawn a picture of a cat at school, simple. Not extraordinary, but it was mine. I proudly showed it to my mom, expecting some kind of praise. Instead, she barely glanced at it before her attention shifted back to Ashley. "Oh, look. Ashley got an A falls on her spelling test," she said with a smile that could light up an entire room. "What a bright girl." I remember sitting there, holding my drawing, waiting for her to notice me again, but she never did. The moment passed, and Ashley, as usual, became the center of our world. It wasn't just the little things, like drawings or spelling tests. It was the big things, too. When I won first place at the regional math competition, at the age of 14, I thought, finally, this would be my moment. I carried that certificate home like it was the most precious thing in the world. I was so proud of myself. But when I handed it to my mother, all I received was a distracted glance as she folded a shirt from the laundry basket. "That's nice, honey," she murmured, barely lifting her eyes. And just as quickly, her attention shifted back to Ashley, who had just returned from a volunteer shift at the hospital. "Isn't that wonderful?" my mother said. "Ashley's making a real impact." Real impact. Those two words stuck with me, like a needle pricking at my chest. No matter what I did, no matter how much effort I put into my accomplishments, they always felt small next to Ashley's. Her hospital volunteer work was meaningful, life-changing, important. But my math competition, my hard work in school, none of it seemed to matter, not to my mother, not to my father either. He had his own way of showing affection, a quiet nod, a smile that never reached his eyes, a distracted grunt. It wasn't that he didn't care. It's that he cared more about keeping things calm, keeping things in order. In the world he created, Ashley was the center, the one who always made him proud. And me. I learned to shrink into the background. I learned how to fade into the walls, how to take up as little space as possible. I worked hard. I succeeded. But I did it in silence, without recognition, without expectation of anything more than the barest acknowledgement. I found a way to survive in that silence. By the time I was in high school, I had 3 jobs, a few shifts at a coffee shop, tutoring younger students, cleaning offices at night. It was exhausting, but it kept me moving, kept me busy. I didn't mind the work. What I minded was the loneliness. I spent my nights studying in my room, working on assignments, all while knowing that my efforts would never compare to Ashley's, would never be worth the time it took to even mention them. In college, things didn't get easier. I carried even more responsibility, and somehow, it felt like my family never noticed how hard I was working. No one asked how I managed to juggle everything: school, work, life. They never asked. Instead, they only wanted to know when the next payment was due for the bills, when Ashley would be home from her latest volunteer program. There were nights when I stayed late at the coffee shop, wiping down tables after the last customers had gone. The sound of the rag moving over the wood was the only thing I could hear, and I would let myself imagine, for just a moment, what it would feel like to be seen. Not celebrated, just noticed. To have someone say, "You're doing a good job," and mean it. But that never happened. I learned to live with the silence. And then, after all those years of working toward something I thought would finally matter, I got into Stanford for my MBA. I remember sitting in the office of my advisor, watching her cry as she congratulated me. Her tears were real, genuine. But when I shared the news with my parents, my mother barely reacted. She nodded, said something about Ashley's rotations in the ER, and that was it. Another moment of my life, another achievement, drowned out by my sister's story. Still, I believed. I believed that maybe this time, after all the hard work, all the sweat, maybe this time things would be different. Maybe this time, My success would tip the scales. Maybe, just maybe, my parents would finally see me for who I was. For who I had become. So when I graduated and decided to book a private dinner at Delmonico, I thought it would be the moment that would bring us together. I invited my parents, thinking that this time they would celebrate me. I paid for everything. The room. The wine. It wasn't about extravagance. It was about building a bridge I had always believed could exist. I thought that maybe, just maybe, we could have one night. Just one, where my achievements would shine. But when they walked in, it didn't go the way I expected. My mother's heels clicked against the floor, like she owned the place, and my father walked in. With that polite indifference that I had come to know so well, they came empty-handed. No flowers, no congratulations. And when they sat down, they didn't even look at me. Not really. They didn't see me. Graduation came and went in a blur, but the week after felt like a dream. I'd spent so many years working toward this moment, Stanford MBA in hand, a prestigious consulting offer waiting for me. But when it finally arrived, I found myself floating, untethered. It should have felt like triumph, but instead it felt like a hollow victory. My family didn't see it. They didn't see me. I booked the dinner at Delmonico because I thought, for once, it could be different. Maybe this time, my parents would actually look at me, see what I had accomplished. Maybe this time, they'd be proud. I thought that just maybe, after all these years of working, they might finally recognize my worth. So, I arranged everything, the reservation, the food, the wine, and it wasn't even about the extravagance. It was about the gesture. I wanted to create the kind of night that could bridge the gap between us. I wanted them to see me, just for a moment. When I walked into the restaurant, I felt the air change around me. The place was elegant, golden lighting, soft music, the glimmer of wine glasses on crisp white linens. Everything was set perfectly. My colleagues had already arrived, and they were warm, kind, genuinely happy for me. For a few moments, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, this night would be different. Maybe they would see me. But then my parents walked in. My mother's heels clicked against the floor, sharp and deliberate, like she owned the place. My father followed with his usual air of polite indifference. Never really looking at me, never really looking at anything, just going through the motions. They didn't come with a card, no flowers, not even a simple congratulations. Nothing. It was as if they couldn't be bothered to acknowledge what I had just accomplished. I greeted them, my smile tight, my voice controlled. Inside, I was already bracing myself, already sensing the familiar disappointment that would follow. My colleagues began to make introductions, speaking about me with the kind of admiration I had longed for from my parents. "You must be so proud of Claire," one of them said, a gentle compliment. My mother's lips thinned, her smile barely a flicker. "We're proud of both our daughters," she said, her voice casual, as if she were reciting something she had said 1,000 times. "But Ashley, she's saving lives in the ER. That's real impact. Real impact." Those words, I had heard them so many times before, each time aimed directly at my accomplishments, making them feel small. Ashley's volunteering at the hospital. Ashley's grades, Ashley's latest achievement. Everything she did was the gold standard. Everything I did, no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I sacrificed, never measured up. It was the same old game, the same old pattern, and I had played along for far too long. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, I had hoped. I had wanted them to see me. To acknowledge me as I was, without comparison to Ashley. But instead, they had dismissed me again. My manager, sensing the discomfort in the air, tried to steer the conversation back to me. "Claire carried our whole intern team last quarter," he said, speaking with the kind of respect I'd never gotten from my parents. "I don't know how she does it." My father chuckled, almost in a mocking way, and shook his head. She's clever, sure. But what Ashley does, that's meaningful work. It's not about being smart. It's about doing something that matters. The words hit like a punch to my gut. I felt the warmth drain from my face as my body tensed, trying to hold back the wave of emotion that was threatening to spill over. I forced a smile, my cheeks aching from the effort. But inside, I was crumbling. The facade was cracking. Then my manager stood up to give a toast. His words were gentle, kind, but I couldn't hear them through the ringing in my ears. He spoke of my capabilities, of my work ethic, of my future. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel proud. I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, my hard work had finally been recognized. But as the applause rang out, I turned toward my parents, hoping to catch even a flicker of pride in their eyes. Instead, I saw my father lean back in his chair, casually murmuring, "Compared to a doctor, it doesn't measure up." My heart sank, the floor tilting beneath me. The words were a knife, cutting deep into the small piece of hope I had allowed myself to hold on to. I felt the room closing in, the heat of embarrassment and shame crawling up my neck. I wanted to speak, to shout, but instead, I felt like I was drowning in the silence that followed. And then my mother, so calmly, so casually, as if it was just another observation, dropped the bomb. "Sometimes I wonder why Claire takes things so seriously," she said, her voice light, almost dismissive. "Ashley never causes this kind of drama." The room felt like it was spinning, my vision blurring as her words pierced through everything I had tried to ignore for years. For the first time, I couldn't breathe. I couldn't keep up the act. I had worked my whole life to make them see me, to make them proud. But all I ever got was this. A constant reminder that nothing I did was ever enough. I could feel the weight of their gaze on me, waiting for me to break down, waiting for me to react the way they expected. But instead, I simply stood up. I didn't say a word. I didn't cry, didn't scream. I just stood up and pushed my chair back, the sound of the legs scraping across the floor slicing through the silence like a blade. "Excuse me," I said, my voice cold, though my heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't look at my mother, didn't look at my father. I didn't even look at my manager, who had half risen from his seat, looking concerned. I walked out of the restaurant. The cold Seattle night hit me as soon as I stepped outside, the rain falling lightly, blurring the lights into streaks of gold and blue. The sound of the traffic seemed distant, muffled by the roar of the blood in my ears. For the first time in my life, I felt completely untethered. The weight of everything that had been building for years finally broke free, but it wasn't freedom that I felt. It was more like severance. Something inside me had finally been cut loose. I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know if I was supposed to feel relieved, angry, or sad. But I didn't cry. I didn't feel any of the things I thought I would. All I felt was the cold air against my skin and a quiet, numb exhaustion. I didn't know what to do with that feeling. I didn't know what came next. But one thing was clear: I couldn't go back to what I had been. The streets of Seattle were wet, the rain falling in light, steady sheets, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and blue. The air was cool, crisp, and it hit me with a shock as I stepped outside the restaurant. The sharpness of it somehow grounding me. For a moment, I just stood there, the sounds of distant traffic humming through the quiet. The clattering of my heels against the pavement, the only noise in the stillness. I couldn't bring myself to go back inside, couldn't face them. Not after what had just happened. My legs felt like they were moving on their own, leading me away from the restaurant, away from the whole night, like it had never happened at all. I wasn't crying. I thought I would be, but the tears never came. Instead, there was just this strange emptiness, an exhaustion that settled into my bones, one that had been building for years. It felt like the weight of everything that had been pressing down on me, the expectations, the disappointment, the silence, had finally broken free. But even as I walked, I wasn't sure what to make of it. The cold air wrapped around me like a heavy blanket, but it didn't comfort me. It only reminded me of how alone I felt. I didn't feel the relief I thought I would. I didn't feel anything except this numbness, this hollow space where everything I had hoped for, everything I had longed to hear from my family, had evaporated. When I reached my apartment, the city's lights were still a distant blur, the soft hum of the world outside a quiet background to the pounding in my chest. I pushed open the door, the sound of it clicking behind me louder than it should have been. I kicked off my heels, the cold hardwood floor pressing against my feet as I sat down, the weight of the world pressing down on my shoulders. My blazer, damp from the rain, hung loosely from my frame. The stillness of the apartment was deafening, but somehow it wasn't empty. It was mine. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the blinking rudder light, as if it would tell me what to do next. My phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with 11 missed calls. 11. Each one from my mother. And one text. "You embarrassed us. I hope you're proud of yourself." Proud? The word twisted inside me. It felt foreign, almost cruel, the way they used it. Proud was something they expected me to feel. Something they demanded of me, when I did everything they asked. When I quietly accepted their disregard for my efforts. But in that moment, I realized I had no idea what it meant anymore. I wasn't proud of them, and they had never been proud of me. Not in the way that mattered. Not in the way that a child should feel when their parents look at them. They had never looked at me. Not really. I pulled myself up from the floor, the damp fabric of my blazer clinging to my skin. I walked over to my desk, my fingers hovering over my bank app. There it was, automatic transfers for the utilities, for Ashley's tuition, for the family mortgage. The same payments I'd made month after month. Without question, without hesitation. But now, something inside me rebelled. For the first time, I wasn't willing to just give any more. I wasn't going to carry their weight anymore. My finger hovered over the screen, unsure. But then it clicked. Cancel. 1, 2, 3. Each confirmation was a small release, a breaking of chains I hadn't even realized were still holding me. The silence in the apartment shifted, and for the first time in years, it wasn't empty. It wasn't painful. It was peaceful. I sank back down to the floor, my body feeling lighter, even though I knew there was still so much more to process. I had made the decision. I had taken control. But there was still a part of me that felt like I was waiting for something, some kind of guilt, some kind of regret. But it never came. Not that night. Not the next day, not even when my phone buzzed again, another message from my mother. It was quiet for a while after that. The days stretched on, and the silence I had feared, so used to the tension, the expectation, the strain of living in the shadow of their neglect, felt different now. It wasn't the same silence. It was one I had chosen. And in some strange way, it felt right, like I had finally broken free. 3 weeks passed. Not a single word from my parents. No apology, no explanation. Just silence. And strangely, I didn't miss them. I didn't miss their control, their disapproval, their inability to see me for who I really was. Instead, I found myself starting to breathe again. Work became my refuge, a place where I could finally feel seen for who I was, not for the daughter who always tried and failed to meet their expectations. My manager gave me more responsibility, pulling me into a restructuring project that consumed my days but never drained me. People at work listened when I spoke. Clients deferred to my judgment. I wasn't invisible anymore. And when a local business magazine reached out to feature the project I had been working on, I agreed without hesitation. The interview, The article, it felt like the first time anyone had noticed me for who I was. It wasn't about them anymore. It wasn't about my parents or their impossible expectations. It was about me. For the first time, it felt like the work I was doing mattered. I mattered. The article went live, and with it, messages poured in. Messages from people who had grown up like I had, people who knew the feeling of being invisible, of always trying to earn the love and respect that was never freely given. Their words were like a lifeline, pulling me further from the life I had left behind. I wasn't alone. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to prove myself anymore. But even as things started to settle, I knew that the silence wouldn't last forever. And sure enough, one afternoon, as I came home after a 12-hour day, still wearing my heels and blazer, I saw two familiar silhouettes through the frosted glass of my apartment door. My stomach dropped. It wasn't the knock that startled me. It was the realization that, after all this time, they still hadn't learned to see me. They still hadn't understood. I stood still for a moment, the cold air seeping through the cracks of my apartment door. The soft glow from the hallway filtered through the frosted glass, casting shadows that felt too familiar. There they were, my parents. The ones who had never truly seen me, never truly heard me. The ones I had spent my whole life trying to prove myself to. I didn't open the door immediately. I wasn't afraid, not anymore. But I was tired of the same old patterns, tired of being expected to carry the weight of their disappointments, their expectations, and their never-ending need for me to fix everything. They hadn't even apologized. Not for the dinner, not for the words my mother had flung at me like daggers. And they hadn't even tried to understand. Not once had they stopped to ask why I had walked out of that restaurant. Why I had stopped pretending. After a few seconds, I opened the door. They didn't wait for me to invite them in. They simply stepped over the threshold like they belonged there. Like nothing had changed. My father didn't speak, as usual, but I could feel his eyes on me. The same distant, calculating look he always gave when he was trying to remain neutral, to stay removed. My mother, on the other hand, didn't waste any time. She walked into my apartment, her heels clicking sharply on the floor, her posture rigid, like she was trying to force me back into the role I had played for so many years. The obedient daughter, the one who did what she was told, the one who carried everyone else's burdens without a word of complaint. "We need to talk," she said, her voice icy and controlled, the same tone she always used when she was about to make demands. I stood in the doorway, just staring at her, not saying a word. I didn't need to. I already knew what this conversation was going to be about. It was always about Ashley. It was always about her needs, her problems, her life. And once again, I was being asked to play the role of the fixer. Ashley's internship ended unexpectedly, my mother said, as if that explained everything. There were cuts. Her tuition balance is overdue, and if it's not taken care of, she'll be asked to take a leave from the program. There it was. The reason they had come. Not to ask how I was doing, not to check if I was okay, not to apologize for the things they had said to me. No, they had come because Ashley needed help, and of course, they expected me to fix it. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I just stood there, waiting for her to continue, knowing she would. "We need your help," she finally said, her voice sharp, demanding, as if it was just another simple request I was supposed to fulfill. The audacity of it hit me like a slap in the face. They had come here, into my space, without even acknowledging what they had done, and now they were asking me to fix things for Ashley. I looked at my father, his face as emotionless as ever, and I felt a surge of something inside me. Anger. But more than that, something else, something stronger. It was the realization that I had been carrying this family for far too long. I had been the one to pick up the pieces, to pay the bills, to make sure they were all okay, while I was left to wither in the background. I shook my head slowly, the words coming out before I could stop them. "You didn't come here to check on me," I said, my voice steady. "You didn't come here to ask how I'm doing, to apologize for what happened at the dinner. You came because you want me to fix Ashley's life again. And you expect me to do it without question. Just like I've always done." My mother's face tightened, her eyes narrowing. She opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off before she could. "No," I said, my voice sharper this time. "I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm done." She took a step toward me, her voice rising, but I held up my hand, cutting her off again. "You don't get to play the family card now," I said, my chest tightening with every word. "Not after everything you've said. After everything you've done. I'm not your backup anymore. I'm not the one you can lean on when things go wrong. And I'm not going to pretend that I haven't been drained by you, by this family, for years." My father straightened, his jaw clenched, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was frustration. But it didn't matter anymore. I wasn't the one who had to fix things. I wasn't the one who had to carry their weight. "We raised you," my father finally said, his voice stiff. "We gave you everything you needed." I laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was bitter. It was all the anger I had held inside for years pouring out in that one short, bitter laugh. "No," I said, taking a step forward, my voice steady now, stronger than it had ever been. "You didn't raise me. You drained me. You took everything I had, and you never once gave anything back. You never saw me for who I was. You only saw what I could do for you." My mother's face froze, her eyes widening for a moment before narrowing again. My father's lips parted, but he didn't speak. For the first time in my life, they looked small. They looked human. They looked like two people standing in front of a truth they couldn't control. I walked toward the door. Not to leave, but to open it. To end this conversation once and for all. The hallway light spilled into the room, bright and cold. "If you came here to apologize," I said quietly, looking at them both, "I'd listen. But if you came to ask for more from me," I paused, my voice calm but unshakable. "That conversation ended the night you disowned me." My mother scoffed, crossing her arms, but I wasn't afraid of her anymore. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice rising with anger. "You'll regret this. Someday, you'll realize you need your family." The words were like a punch, but they didn't hurt the way they used to. I looked at her, looked her right in the eyes, and for the first time in my life, I felt taller than her. Taller than both of them. "I already have," I said, my voice firm. "I'm not the one who needs you anymore. It's the other way around." The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating, but this time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like liberation. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had to shrink. I didn't feel like I had to apologize for being who I was. I wasn't the one who had to make things right. The door clicked shut behind them, and I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of their absence. Finally, for the first time in years, I was free. The days following that moment felt strangely quiet. For once, there was no noise in my head, no constant stream of anxiety about when the next phone call would come, or when my parents would demand something from me. The silence was something I had feared for so long, but now it felt different. It was mine, it was peace. Work became my refuge. The project I had been assigned at the firm was consuming, and for the first time, I didn't mind. It kept me busy. It kept me focused. And when my manager began giving me more responsibility, pulling me into more high-level meetings, I felt like I was finally being seen, not just by my colleagues but by myself. I was more than just the daughter who had always been waiting for validation. I was more than the one who had always been expected to fix everything. I was capable. I was doing something important. I buried myself in the work. It wasn't about escaping my feelings, not really. It was about proving to myself that I could stand on my own, that I didn't need to rely on anyone else to feel worthy. Slowly, the weight of everything I had been carrying, my family's expectations, the emotional manipulation, started to lift. And though I was still healing, though I still felt the occasional sting from the silence my parents had left me with, I began to grow into something I hadn't recognized before. One afternoon, as I was walking to my office, I passed a newsstand and caught a glimpse of my own name. I stopped, blinking, confused. There, on the cover of a local business magazine, was an article about the restructuring project I had been leading. My name was front and center, a headline I had never imagined would be mine. I hadn't even realized the interview had been published. I felt a strange mix of disbelief and pride as I read the headline, Rising Consultant Claire Thompson Takes on Corporate Restructuring, Achieves Unprecedented Results. The article itself highlighted the success of the project, the numbers, the impact. But more than that, it spoke about resilience. It spoke about how I had managed to thrive despite the challenges, despite the obstacles. How I had built something from nothing, all on my own. It was everything I had hoped to be recognized for. And for the first time in my life, it wasn't being overshadowed by Ashley's achievements. Messages began to pour in. Emails, LinkedIn messages, even comments from strangers who had read the article. People who had faced the same kind of emotional neglect, who had struggled with the same expectations, reached out to tell me that my story had given them hope. For a brief moment, I felt like I wasn't alone anymore. That maybe, in some small way, I was helping others feel seen, just like I had always longed to feel. But with the success came something I had been expecting, but hadn't prepared for. The silence from my parents. It wasn't the soft kind of silence that felt like peace. It was the kind that carried weight. The kind that made you question whether you were really free or just waiting for the next thing to fall apart. 3 weeks passed without a word from them. Not a single phone call, not a single apology. Just emptiness. It was the same kind of silence I had grown up with. The silence that had made me feel like I was invisible. That nothing I did ever mattered. Only now, the silence didn't have the same power over me. I didn't feel small anymore. I didn't feel like I was waiting for their approval to be worthy. One evening, as I sat at my desk, reading through a proposal for a new client, I felt the familiar buzz of my phone. My heart skipped, and I saw their names light up the screen. It was my mother, of course. The message read, "Claire, we need to talk. Your father is having some financial trouble, and Ashley's tuition is due. We need you to help again." The message hit me like a wave, but this time, I didn't feel that old, familiar pull. I didn't feel the need to immediately jump into action, to take responsibility for something that wasn't mine to fix. I had already decided I wasn't going to be the one who carried their burdens anymore. I had already let go. I stared at the message for a moment, my fingers hovering over the screen, but I didn't reply. Instead, I put the phone down and returned to my work. For the first time, the weight of my family's expectations didn't dictate my next move. I wasn't going to answer their call for help. Not this time. Not when it came with the same manipulative tone I had grown so used to. As the days passed, I realized I had started to think differently. I had started to think about myself in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before. I wasn't defined by my family, by their needs, or by the constant search for their approval. I was more than that. And with every day that passed, I became more certain of it. One evening, as I walked home from the office, I passed a small cafe on the corner and noticed Jessica sitting at a table outside. her eyes glued to her phone. I walked up to her, and she looked up, a wide smile crossing her face when she saw me. "I didn't think I'd see you here tonight," she said, standing up and hugging me. "I've been a little busy," I replied, sitting down next to her. "Work's been good. Really good." Jessica raised an eyebrow, leaning in slightly. "Good, that's an understatement. You're in the magazine." I saw the article. I smiled, the pride in my chest swelling again. "Yeah, it's strange, but I think it's real this time. I feel like I've finally made it, without needing anyone to tell me I did." She nodded, her eyes softening. "You deserve it, Claire. I'm so proud of you." For the first time in my life, hearing those words didn't feel like a distant wish. It didn't feel like something I was waiting for. It felt true. It felt like something I had earned, something I had built on my own. And in that moment, I realized that I didn't need my parents to be proud of me. I didn't need their validation to know that I had done something worthwhile. I had already done it. And I was finally at peace with that. I came home after a long day, my shoulders aching from hours spent hunched over my desk, going over spreadsheets, plans, and proposals. The apartment felt different. The silence was no longer suffocating, it was my space now. There was a quiet comfort in it. Something that had once felt foreign, but now felt like mine to own. I kicked off my shoes and set my bag down by the door. The evening light filtered through the windows, casting a soft glow across the room. Just as I was about to sit down to relax, I heard it. A knock at the door. I paused, a chill running through me, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I should ignore it. But the sound came again, a gentle tap. My heart sank. I already knew who it was. When I opened the door, there they were. My parents. Standing in my hallway, like they had every right to be there. They hadn't called, hadn't sent a message to check on me. But here they were, as if nothing had changed. My mother's face was set in a hard line, the usual control in her eyes. My father's expression was the same as always, distant, unreadable. They didn't wait for an invitation. They simply stepped inside, like they had been here 100 times before. "We need to talk," my mother said, her voice clipped and businesslike. There was no hesitation, no softening of her words. Just the same tone she always used when she had something to demand. I stepped aside and let them enter. I wasn't afraid of them anymore. But I could feel something, an old, familiar ache, stirring in me. A part of me that still longed for the approval that had always eluded me. The part of me that still wished things could be different, even though I knew better now. They walked into the living room and sat down without asking. It was as if they still believed that their presence alone was enough to make everything go their way. "Ashley is having some trouble," my mother began, her eyes never meeting mine. Her internship ended unexpectedly. There were cuts. She needs help with her tuition. If we don't pay it, she won't be able to finish her program. I could feel the anger rising within me, but I held it back. I had heard this story before. Ashley, the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, always needing something, always being the center of attention. And there I was, again, expected to fix it, to clean up the mess. My father finally spoke, his voice as flat as ever. "We raised you to take care of the family," he said, as if that explained everything. "We did what we could. It's your turn to help." It was the same thing they always said. The same words that made me feel like I was nothing more than a cog in the machine, always working, always sacrificing, and never once being seen for who I really was. I felt a rush of heat flood my chest, and I forced myself to stay calm. "You didn't raise me," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the surge of emotion. "You drained me. You took everything I had, and you never once gave anything back." There was a sharp silence. My mother's eyes flashed with anger, and my father shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with my words. But I wasn't going to back down. Not now. You came here, not to ask how I'm doing, not to apologize for what happened at dinner, but because you want me to fix things for Ashley. Again, I continued, my voice growing firmer. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm not carrying your burdens. Not this time. Not when I've been carrying them for years. My mother's face twisted in frustration. You're being unreasonable, she snapped. Family is family. You don't just walk away from us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I didn't let it show. You disowned me, I said, stepping closer to them, my voice cold. You made that decision when you chose to ignore me, to belittle me, to make everything about Ashley. I'm not your backup anymore. I'm not the one who fixes everything. I'm done. My father opened his mouth to say something, but I didn't let him. You never saw me, I said, my words cutting through the thick air. You saw what I could do for you, but you never saw who I am. Not once. There was another long silence. My mother's lips tightened, and she crossed her arms, as if trying to regain control of the situation. My father looked away, his jaw clenched. They didn't know what to say. I'm not going to fix this, I said quietly, the words slipping out with a finality I had never allowed myself before. I'm not your daughter who always fixes everything. I'm not the one who's supposed to make your lives easier. Not anymore. For the first time, I felt no guilt, no hesitation. There was only clarity. I had given everything to this family. And now, it was time to take it all back. If you came here to apologize, I said, my voice softer now, but no less firm, I'd listen. But if you came to ask for more from me, that conversation ended the night you disowned me. My mother scoffed, shaking her head. You'll regret this, she muttered, her voice low. You'll realize one day that you need us. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of her words wash over me. But instead of shrinking back, I felt a sense of peace. I wasn't the one who needed them. It was the other way around. And I didn't need them to see that. You're right, I said, my voice steady, clear. Maybe one day I'll realize that. But for now, I don't need you. Not like this. Not anymore. I walked to the door and opened it wide, letting the hallway light spill into the room. It's time for you to leave. They didn't speak. My mother hesitated, as if searching for something, an angle, a way to regain control, but there was nothing left to take. No leverage left to use. With a final, bitter glance, my mother turned and walked out the door. My father followed slowly, his steps heavy. When the door clicked shut behind them, I felt a shift inside me. The silence that filled the apartment was different now. It was mine. Finally. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for their approval. For the first time, I wasn't shrinking back. I had done it. I had let go. And in doing so, I had found something I had never had before. Freedom. In the days that followed, everything seemed to settle into a strange rhythm. The silence from my parents continued, and with it, I began to feel something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that felt empty or cold. It was the kind that filled the space they had left behind. I had spent so much of my life trying to earn their approval, trying to bend myself to fit their expectations, that I never realized how heavy that weight was. Now, for the first time in years, I felt light. Work had always been a constant in my life, but now it felt different. It was no longer just something I did to survive, to fill the empty spaces. It became a reflection of who I was. I wasn't just working to keep up with everyone else's demands. I was working because I wanted to. I was building something for myself. Something I could be proud of, without needing anyone to validate it. And that felt like freedom. The project I had been leading reached a milestone, and the results were beyond anyone's expectations. The company had been restructuring, and the numbers I had crunched, the strategies I had implemented, were paying off in ways I hadn't even dreamed of. The success felt incredible, but even more so, the recognition from my colleagues and clients felt earned. I wasn't just a cog in the machine anymore. I was driving it forward. For the first time in my career, I didn't feel invisible. One morning, as I walked into the office, my manager pulled me aside with a look that caught me off guard. His smile was genuine, but there was something else in his eyes. "Claire," he said, his tone different than usual, "we're going to feature you in an upcoming leadership piece. Your work on this project has been exceptional, and I think it's time everyone sees what you've been doing." The words hit me like a wave, but instead of the familiar sense of doubt, of wondering if I really deserved it, I felt something else: pride. Real pride. Not the kind that was tied to anyone else's approval, but the kind that was entirely mine. I had earned this. I had built it. And no one could take it away from me. The feature came out a few weeks later. The article was more than just a business piece. It was about resilience, about rising up when everything seemed stacked against you. It spoke of how I had taken charge of a massive project in the face of uncertainty. How I had navigated through challenges and come out on top. For the first time, I wasn't just a backdrop to someone else's story. I was the one telling it. The messages started pouring in soon after. Some were from colleagues, some from clients, but there were others, strangers, people who had seen the article and reached out to tell me how my story resonated with them. They had lived through their own struggles, their own battles with family expectations, with the pressure to always be something more than they were. They saw themselves in me. And for the first time in my life, I realized that maybe my story wasn't just about me. Maybe, just maybe, it could help others see that they didn't have to live in the shadows of other people's expectations either. I found myself reading their messages late into the night, each one a small piece of the puzzle I had been trying to figure out for so long. And with each message, I felt the weight of my past, the years of striving to be enough for my parents, slip away a little more. I had been so focused on what I thought I needed to prove, so focused on earning love and validation from the people who had never truly seen me. But now, I was being seen, and that was enough. That was more than enough. It wasn't just the work that had changed. It was me. I had spent so much of my life waiting for someone else to recognize my worth. But the moment I stopped waiting, the moment I started seeing myself, everything else shifted. The world didn't change, not really. But I did. A few weeks after the article came out, I ran into Jessica at a cafe. She had a wide smile on her face as soon as she saw me. "Claire," she said, pulling me into a hug, "I saw the article. You did it. You finally did it." I smiled, feeling something shift inside me. I didn't do it for them. I said, the words coming out more easily than I expected. I did it for me. Finally. We sat down together, and as we talked about the work, about life, I realized something else. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I wasn't just holding it all together because that was what was expected of me. I was thriving. I was living for myself. And in that moment, I knew that I had finally found the person I had been searching for all along. Not the daughter my parents wanted me to be, not the person I thought I should be, but the woman I had become. I no longer needed to look back. I didn't need to wait for their approval. I didn't need their approval to know that I was enough. I had always been enough. I had just had to learn to see it for myself, and as the days passed, I found a new kind of peace. The kind that came from knowing who I was and knowing that, no matter what, I was going to keep moving forward. For the first time, I was free. Truly free. Seattle's skyline was beautiful that night. The lights shimmering below me. The city alive with energy. I stood on my balcony, a glass of water in my hand, and for the first time, I wasn't wishing for my parents to call. I wasn't hoping for an apology. I wasn't rehearsing what I would say if they did. I was just standing there, looking at the city, knowing that I was exactly where I needed to be. And for the first time, I didn't feel alone.